Um, anyway, we did see that there are some definite problems we're facing. And by the way, I would sort of reinforce what Stephen Strong just said. What we're facing today is a collision between inexorable forces. The volatility, the high prices we're seeing in oil and gas reflect this convergence of what Stephen Strong called the perfect storm. The limits we're facing are both on the supply side and on the capacity of the environment to handle our excesses. And this is what's happening is we're seeing an inexorable tendency for our society to want to continue to grow. And it's that growth, and it's exponential growth. We call it steady growth, but it's essentially compounded growth. Essentially is going to overwhelm any resource, any renewable, fossil, and environmental resource essentially is going to have a limited capacity, and we will exceed that if we continue on a path of exponential growth. So what I would like to point out is that's a little different from what you've been hearing, and that is that the problem isn't the supply, the problem isn't the environment, the problem is that we have this phenomenon of growth that wants to overwhelm it. Even the example of the renewable resource that wind represents, as Stephen Strong pointed out, we have at least 3 times our current electrical capability in the wind resource alone. But 3 times can be overwhelmed in just a few generations. That's a limited resource. Easter Island was covered with trees when the first settlers found it. When the Europeans got there, it was denuded of trees. The population, which went through a peak, had declined to a handful of people who were resigned to living in caves, eating rats and each other. That's not the exact way we want to see our civilization end. The hopeful point is, this is an example of a situation which looked hopeless. This is the Apollo 13 mission, which you all recall nearly ended in disaster. Partway through the mission, they had a sudden bang, discovered that their energy supply was much less than they thought. A lot of analogies here. They were on the wrong course. The dotted line would have brought them safely back to Earth, but they had left that course and they were headed off into a different trajectory which would have brought them back toward the Earth and on by. So they had to make a course correction. We have to make a course correction. They had to use less energy, not just because it would be nice to use less energy, but they only had a limited supply, and to make it back, to make it so soft, safe landing, which we would like to do as a society. We'd like to make a soft landing in a sustainable energy economy. To do that required the course corrections, and they had to conserve energy, make do with what they had. Okay? They didn't have time to get a resupply ship. Okay? They couldn't turn to another source. They had to make do with what they had. Okay? They had to use enough less that every time they fired up the lunar lander to use the rocket engine, they used up some of that precious energy. They had to make the course correction, they had to use that energy, so they had to use enough less energy than was available to make the course correction. So we also need to do the same thing. We're limited in resources, not just energy, not just energy, what else? Time. Time is a terrific resource if you have it, but we don't have it. And money. Everything we've heard about today, all the options are going to take enormous investments. So what do? We're out of energy, we're out of time, and we're out of money. What is the option? There is only one that I'm aware of that really addresses this issue, and that is to use less. Just like the Apollo 13 astronauts, you use enough less that you have some energy to spare to make the transition, course correction, what have you, to make it back. They had one other problem. They had carbon dioxide building up in their atmosphere. Sound familiar? Okay. They had to solve that problem or they wouldn't make it back alive. We have to solve that problem too. And if we choose wisely, we will solve all of the problems with the same actions. But we have to have a basis for making our decisions, and it has to be, the goal has to be what will get us to where we want to be. And I think as Stephen Strong pointed out that we need to look at where we want to be and then work backwards. I think it was an earlier speaker. Anyway, that's what we need to do. So, this is a graph which could be oil, gas, United States in the past, 1970 we peaked, or the present. But notice that the curve there is an exponential growth curve. That represents 2% annual growth, and it just goes higher and higher and higher. That essentially represents the dilemma we face, which is if we are indeed, as it sounds, approaching the point of near a plateau or nearing the top of that peak, then we're going to see the shortages are going to be producing a very volatile price environment. And the problem that was identified by one of our first speakers is that the volatility essentially destroys people's faith in the price mechanism as a signal for time to do something. The problem goes away, comes back again. And for all they know, it's going to just keep on doing that. But we're facing a severe long-term prospect there. So the reality is that there is nothing ready to go. Like I said, we have to figure out how to use the resources we have available in the wisest possible way. And what we tend to do is start off on the third line here, which is what we need to do is, and we argue about what's the best thing, nuclear, alcohol, whatever you want to call it, wind, solar. But we really need to realize that the real problem is that we have a finite amount of energy which will in fact be overwhelmed by the growth, okay? So our objective has to be to transition to sustainability before we use up our resources, and we need to rapidly reduce consumption to buy time. That's the only way we're going to buy the time. And we'll have also lower costs because lower demand means lower costs, and we'll have some energy left over for the things we need. And we have something else we can do with the time, which is figure out which scenarios make the most sense. I'd like to see a computer game where you have the number of chips and you say, okay, if I put the chips in this pile, do I get to where I want to, or do I reallocate the chips in a different way and see which one works best? I think you'll find that investing in solar or wind is going to beat out nuclear power because we can do it right now incrementally, et cetera. This is a graph which dramatized what I just told you about, which is declining, reducing our consumption rapidly, creating a reserve, buying time, and that's from a book by John Howe. So we have to do the same thing that Apollo 13 astronauts did. There's a concept known as Jevons paradox. It has a qualifier in it. Eventually, any savings we produce will be squandered. So it doesn't make any difference, we're told. But if we take the savings, time, money, and energy, and invest them wisely, we will, in fact, be able to make a difference. This is just a kind of a map of where we have to go. We got to go flat out on 3 different paths. One is to educate and begin to make plans in case of disruptions. We got to reduce our consumption. Conservation, by the way, is different. We can conserve by efficiency, but conservation, when I say that, I really mean changing the way we do things. Efficiency takes time, money, and energy to implement. But if we save by changing the way we do things, carpooling, telecommuting, we have a liquid fuels issue, we have a gas and electricity issue. This is a global energy crisis. In the long term, we want to reach sustainability. We need to, as soon as possible, begin to make our industries self-powered, our homes self-powered. Everything we do, we need to figure out how to do sustainably as soon as possible and unplug ourselves from the vicissitudes of fossil energy. And this is a global problem. We're all in the same boat. Let's challenge the world to a race to sustainability rather than a race to consume the last drop of oil. I can flash through some of the slides that we saw earlier today. This is a good one. This, by the way, is one of the first slides I saw today which got my attention, because we need to make a transition from the fossil fuels that we're used to newer types of fuels. And liquid fuels, we're going to have to resort to some kind of sustainable energy resources, which obviously are bio-derived. This is a technology which is one that has potential to bridge. It's already being used for fossil fuels, natural gas and coal, but we can also use the same technology to make use of biofuels in a much more efficient way, by the way, than fermentation, I believe. This is an attempt that I came up with to put all on one slide, all the different, assuming we've committed ourselves to efficiency, and we're on the way to that. Then we need to look at the best use of our resources in terms of the supplies. And what I've done here, if you'll notice about halfway down the slide, there is one that looks really pretty good. The right side, by the way, are the pluses, and on the left side are the costs. The pluses look like they're pretty good for conservation and efficiency, and the costs are pretty minimal. All right, things on the left side are the time it takes to implement, the actual cost, the environmental impacts, and if you had the time, you could look through this, and it's an arbitrary scoring system. I just ranked on a 1 to 10 scale and gave a little bar for each one proportionately. But this is the kind of criteria we need to come up with to evaluate our choices and make sure we do use the resources that are finite: time, capital, and energy itself. The problem has not gone away. It will be with us for a long time. We need to stay the course. We need to know that this is something which is going to, the vicissitudes of the volatility of the prices simply distracts from the reality, underlying reality. People do not know this, and our job is to go out and make sure they do understand this. Thank you.